All right, everybody, it is 9:40, so we'll get started. I'm Nupur Davis. I'm the CISO at Comcast, and I also run product privacy for Comcast. And with me is
Doina Prash, and I'm running the De-Identification Center of Excellence at Comcast.
And Doina just told me that she did one of her bucket list items and ran the Golden Gate Bridge from Fisherman's Wharf to
all the way to the other side of
and then back. So that was while I was just kind of like lounging around watching TV. She was doing that. So all right. So today we're going to talk to you about data privacy concerns and specifically a risk-based approach to de-identification. And we will, go through the whole thing, what de-identification is, how we do it, what the benefits are, and so on. I'm going to go past the disclaimer slides and the session again. We'll start with the regulatory landscape because you need to understand that to kind of go, why do you need to do de-identification? We'll talk about what our process is, the science, and then as Doina says, the art and the math. It is all of that to do de-identification. How do you get started? And then really the biggest, hopefully the takeaway is this something that will benefit your organization? How could you get started? The kind of strategy and questions that you should ask as you start on this journey. So with that, let me just do some background. So we have, Comcast has always been really focused on privacy. When you think about it, I don't know how many of you are our customers, but you live your digital lives on our platforms. Thank you for being our customers. Some of you raised your hands. And that was never more true than it was during the pandemic, right? Like we were going to school and doing medical visits and Zoom and Teams and entertainment, of course, and just about every aspect of our life just became digital and it was lived on our platforms. And so privacy has always been super important to us. But the thing that made us focus like a laser on this issue, refocus, is the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2019 that went into effect in 20. And it's so we went back and looked at our principles of our privacy. This is on our website. And I'll just go through, on the website there's a paragraph for each, but I'll just go through a couple of the headings, right? So the first one is, where you go on the internet is your business, not ours. We do not track, we have never tracked. Sometimes there are all kinds of like conspiracy theories, but it's like, it is our commitment, it is on our website. We do not sell information that identifies you. We've never done it, we don't do it. We do not sell your location data. We believe that strong cybersecurity is foundational to good privacy. And that is why my team does both, because there is a lot of overlap between the two. And then we, of course, give our customers, our former customers, our potential customers, our employees, all of the stakeholders, we give them the tools and support that is needed for us to comply with these principles, right? So here is just a sample of applicable laws and regulations. I'm not going to read this, but the interesting thing are the words, right? So if you look at the words that keep popping up are security, protection, privacy, reporting, and that is really, again, the foundational aspect of running a privacy program. Again, if you think about a Venn diagram, right, and you take cybersecurity and you take privacy and you take data, if you take those three things, right, there's a large intersection in the middle. And that is where a lot of our team does the work that we do. So some of our privacy functional areas, the first one is individual rights request. And I'll focus on that for a bit. So almost all of those laws and regulations can be mapped to a few common things that you have to do. And one is this IRR. And what does an IRR do? This means that if you are a current customer, current employee, a former customer, a potential customer, you have the following rights. You have the right to ask us, what information are you collecting about us? And then we are obligated to tell you the metadata, right? We're collecting this type of information. But then you can also say, send me the information that you have about me, right? So now we have to actually send you the data that we have about you. And then the third is correct the data that you have about me, or let me correct it. And the fourth is delete data you have about me. Now, you can't delete all data that you have about, because otherwise we couldn't provide you the service, right? If we don't know your home location where the service goes to, we can't do that, right? So access, what do you have about me, and can you send me a copy of that? Can I delete the data that you have about me that you don't need to conduct your business with me? Can I correct? Can I opt out? And can I restrict processing, right? So there's a whole lot of infrastructure that is built to support those individual rights. There's experience, opting in, opting out, cookie consent, all kinds of ways, and we want to make sure that privacy doesn't come at the expense of bad experience for our stakeholders. Data management is huge. The biggest, hardest part of data management is discovery. Where are your data in your enterprise? But then when you find them, you have to classify it. What part of it is PI, what is SNPI. You have to minimize it, and you have to protect it. Now, minimization is where de-identification comes in. So minimization says basically, how long are you keeping the data? And we've gone through every data type we have and come up with retention schedules, right? It can be we don't keep it at all, we just process it, let it go, to we may keep it for a day or a month or 45 days, right? So it's a period of time. The other way to minimize data is to deduplicate. And then the third way to minimize data is to de-identify, and we'll talk about that today. Vendor governance and then legal operations, these are just some of the parts of doing a privacy program. So our organizational components are, again, the legal team, our chief privacy officer really drives our privacy program, and then the security and product privacy, which is my team, our business units that actually do the work, and then data operations, which is a huge team that actually lives outside my organization, but that we do data minimization for that team and for the rest of the company. So why de-identification? All of the compliance and regulatory needs that we just talked about, if we can de-identify a data set, and de-identifying a data set means that I am reducing the probability, the statistically determined probability of re-identification to a certain acceptable risk threshold, right? And what does that mean? And Joanna will talk about this a lot more in detail, but I'll give you an example. If I have a data set and I have a row of data in it that says it's a male, wears red suit, has a snowy beard, shows up on December 25, I don't need a lot more information. I can infer that we're probably talking about Santa Claus, right? So that is identifying somebody from some of the data that is in a data set, right? And what de-identification does is, how do we transform that data set so that that statistical probability of re-identifying somebody from that data set is below an acceptable threshold? So for example, I could take away some of the attributes of this person, like maybe the red suit, or maybe the fact that they show up on December 25, that makes the chance of re-identification lesser, right? So that's what de-identification is about. But the reason we do it is, first of all, it'll protect personal information because you can't re-identify. Second is that it increases security posture, right? The more identification I can remove from a data set, the less valuable that data set becomes to a hacker or to a threat actor. And then finally, it enables the business to continue to innovate on that data set without having to delete that data set. So a de-identified set of data is exempt from some of those regulatory requirements, right? So for example, minimization and retention. So if you have a data set that has identifiable information, you are your retention schedule may say you can only keep this data for 45 days. If you've de-identified that data, then you can keep it for, as long as you need it for whatever purpose that you need it for. Now, you lose some capability as you de-identify data. Doina's going to talk about, how do you make that balance, right? So that's why we do de-identification, remove personal information, increase the security posture, and enable business innovation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doina, and Doina, just walk us through.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try to make statistics sound exciting. It's really what it's all about. So what is de-identification? So the process of removing the relationship or the association between a data subject and identifiable data. With higher degrees of privacy, you have a more aggressive degree of de-identification, but what that actually gives you at the end of the day, you're using the data utility. So at the end of the day, the decision of how do you de-identify has to do with where does the data reside and what is your usage of the data. As mentioned, it's really a spectrum, it's not one thing. So if we start on the right, we start with identifiable data and we go through multiple stages. The more we move to the left, we use statistical formulas to try to quantify the risk of re-identification for the data. So at Comcast, we try to stay within the anonymization and strongly pseudonymization type of de-identification. So let's go through a few definitions. We have the data subject, which is the individual, or in Comcast's case, it's the household, the account. Identity is what we know about an individual. Identifiability, extent to which a person can be identified. We also have 3 levels of classifications in the context of de-identification. It's direct identifiers, quasi-identifiers, and non-identifiers. Direct identifiers are data elements that are directly identifying an individual. So some examples are name, social security, driver's license, email address, so on and so forth. So by definition, if you are attempting to do any level of de-identification, all of the direct identifiers have to be eliminated. Now, once we get past the direct identifiers, we'll go into quasi-identifiers. Quasis are data elements that help describe an individual. Nupur brought up the example of Santa Claus, the red suit, the beard. Other data elements are gender, date of birth, zip code. A typical example is if you combine these 3 data elements together, you can identify every other individual. So it's basically 50% re-identifiability. If you were actually to try to achieve a less degree of re-identifiability, if you take the date of birth and reduce it to just the year of birth, and you take the zip code from a 5-digit zip code to a 3-digit zip code, which brings your risk of identification to below 0.04%. So as you can see, you have 3 data elements, which are kind of on their own not really a big deal, but combined together, it's really mind-boggling of the level of re-identification that you can do with these 3 data elements. And just a simple transformation brings you up to a completely different level. To take it one step further, we classify the quasi-identifiers into public quasi-identifiers and acquaintance quasi-identifiers. And this is relevant in the context of how the risk is being calculated, because there's 2 separate risks. Acquaintance quasi-identifiers, data accessed by knowing the subject directly, so it's not publicly available. If you think about it, less amount of people know about it, but it's more personal to you. So it kind of identifies, but not too many people know it. A public quasi-identifier is data that is publicly available about you. And again, think about it, maybe more generic, but a lot more people have access to that information. So again, these are 2 different risks that we're calculating when we're looking at the data. So what are the components for de-identification? So there's really 3 big buckets here that I wanted to talk about. Is we have data risk. When we look at de-identification, we're really looking at 2 big components: is the data and then the context. From a data perspective, we have the 2 risks: the public risk and the acquaintance risk, which again have completely different formulas just by the sheer nature of how data is being accessed, the type of information that it has. And then you have uniqueness score. This is always calculated regardless of of whichever other risk is being taken. And usually when you calculate the public and the acquaintance, you take the highest between the two, and that goes into the ultimate formula for calculating the overall risk. Uniqueness always has to fall below a 0.04% threshold in order for the data to be considered anonymized, which is, again, the highest level of data identification. So that's on the data side. Then you look at the context. Context, it really has to do with where does the data reside. So for example, if your data stays within the organization is one thing. If you're sharing the data with a third party, it's a completely different situation. Or if the data is being actually released publicly. When you look at that, you calculate two separate risks. It's a deliberate attempt, inadvertent attempt, and risk of breach. Deliberate attempt and somebody intentionally has access to the data and is trying to re-identify someone. Inadvertent when somebody's actually doing their job and not intentionally, but kind of has access to a data set and looks at it and says, oh, I think I know, that's my neighbor. And the risk of breach is the least chance of it happening, but the highest I guess this is the most problematic is the risk of breach, when somebody actually breaches you and gets access to your entire data set. So we've talked about the data, we've talked about context. Now let's talk about the re-identification threshold. So even when you reach anonymization, you'll never have a situation when you'll have a 0% risk. So you have to select a threshold of the acceptable risk, and it's usually done by the business. We've simplified it a little bit, and we have a questionnaire that is released, and then the business answers a couple of questions, and based on the score, we identify the threshold. So we have three thresholds. It's low, medium, high. The questions are really in line with the three major categories: consent, invasion of privacy, and reputational damage. Consent is not really an issue for Comcast because we always have consent. It's not really a parameter in this one. But invasion of privacy and reputational damage are the two key data points that we're looking at, and it has to do with the type of data that is in the actual data set, the size of the data set, and kind of assessing what would happen if somebody got access to this data. So this is our re-identification risk formula. Again, we've talked about the data risk. We picked the highest between the acquaintance risk and the public risk. We multiplied with the highest of the context risks, the three risks that we've calculated, and we come up with the overall risk, which has to fall below the re-identification threshold. Again, low, medium, high threshold. It does have a number behind it, and in order for you to consider the data set de-identified, it has to fall below the threshold. Let's talk a little bit about the process. So we started our journey around 2019. It was an interesting time because before, all the research that was done in the space was done in the medical field space, and more specifically clinical trials. And I don't think it's accurate to say that their data is more complex, but I think a better word would be multidimensional. So their formulas are a lot more complex. So we went to the drawing board and looked at all of the research that was out there with help with Privacy Analytics, which is an external company, experts in the field. We looked at the formulas and we've simplified them in the context of the categories of data that we have within Comcast. We identified use cases, we defined the standards, the certification process, we put some parameters around re-attestation as well, and who doesn't love exception process on top of it. But we've been doing this for quite a few years and we have not had exceptions yet, so which is good. I think people are scared, and I think they're seeing the value of going through the process because ultimately they want to be able to use the data. Then we did a huge round of education, so we've included in our privacy training across the entire enterprise. We've presented at the security guilds, we've done road shows, and we also do a lot of presentations for the BISO engagement. I usually joke about it. I don't like to chase people, I just do the work. So I don't have to, people usually ask, well, how do you get to it? So we do have a couple of mechanisms within the organization that actually interfaces with a lot of the applications, so they are usually our intake into our process. We're part of our PIA, the Privacy Impact Assessment, and we have started a lot of architects that do threat modeling on a lot of our applications, and if it's a candidate, they send them our way. Obviously, the Comcast Privacy Program, which is an overarching program at Comcast, also sends people our way. And the last and hopefully the least, but is the internal audit who catches anybody who doesn't comply with the policies that we have. We do have some robust reporting. I hate project management, so what I do is I just put everything on a dashboard so anybody can go see what's going on within my team. And we are plugged into the privacy controls framework to provide a dashboard capability with multiple controls that we have related to privacy within the organization. So let's go through our process. It's a 10-step process. So the first thing, once we get a request, is we go through a kickoff meeting where we talk to the application team and say, okay, and try to figure out if de-identification is possible, necessary, and possible. So we go through the use cases. We try to figure out what the categories of data that the team has. And if the process, if the data is deemed as a candidate for de-identification, we move into classification of the data. As I mentioned earlier, 3 categories: direct, quasis, and non-identifiers. So we classify the data attributes. We do have some automatic classifications within probably you figured out that everywhere there's a robot, there's some type of automation. So we have a tool for that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's some auto classification, but ultimately it is really, really very specific to the context of the data set itself. So as I've mentioned before, you have a zip code. A zip code by itself in a data set, it's really not a big deal. But when combined with other data elements, certain elements can change their classification depending on the rest of the data in the data set. So probably a good example here that I had to deal with, we were de-identifying a set of streaming data from our devices. So we're looking at the events pertaining to all of, for the usage of our streaming app. And there was 2 data elements, one of them being a city, and the other one being an @, which was the event date. By themselves, not a big deal. The city is generic enough to not necessarily allow you to identify someone. But when you combine the city with the actual date, think about it, it places you in a particular location at a particular point in time. So we don't just look at the de-identification horizontally, where we're looking at just the data elements that we can combine. We're looking at it vertically too. So when you start taking, if you didn't have anything else, but you start having vertically this location and date, it starts creating travel patterns, and it can absolutely identify someone. So, so we had to deal with that in a very interesting way. So we classify the data, then we select the re-identification threshold, which is the low, medium, high that I talked about. Then we set up the risk measurement pipeline, and then remove all direct identifiers, and then we load the data and start playing with it. So our sample data is really the entire data set, and everybody freaks out when I say that. We don't select a sample from the data set, but it's the entire data set, but it's only the quasi-identifier. So we don't, data sets are huge, but we're looking at, let's say for the sake of the argument, maybe 5, 10 quasi-identifiers. So just those data elements, but it's the entire data set. And then we run it through our risk engine, and at the end, try to figure out, are we below the threshold or are we not? If we're not below the threshold, we really have to go to trying to futz with the data or the context. So we're doing the risk mitigation, we start doing transformations. Some of the typical transformations are, you can either get rid of it if you can, if it's not relevant. You can substring, you can range, you can bucketize data elements. So again, substringing would be zip code. Zip5 will never pass uniqueness as such, so you always have to take it to zip3. We also have ranges. So for example, you don't use a specific age, you bucketize in buckets of 5, 10, whatever is acceptable. You have data shifts. So look, if the date is relevant but not relevant to the exact date, you can start shifting dates, and is also considered a way of kind of diffusing the data. So those are just a few types of transformations that we apply. So we start applying the transformations, and we rerun the risk. We rerun the risk calculations and try to figure out. And we do that a couple of times until we actually reach the risk of re-identification falling below the threshold. Once that's done, because we do it very closely with the application teams and with the business teams, we don't just in a vacuum do all these transformations. We usually talk to the applications. Okay, what's acceptable to you? You have these data elements. This is what you can do. This is the one that are causing the higher risk, so we have to transform them. So it's usually the feedback comes from them on the allowable transformation. So once you're below the threshold, the utility is validated. We generate a spec for the application teams for them to create, to use as a specification for their de-identification process. All that is being documented, and we are done. This is a glimpse of our tool. So again, when we started the process, saw the opportunity for automation, and looks very, very similar to the steps that we've kind of talked about. So it's very workflowy, but you go from an intake process, data classification, risk configuration, and this is our risk calculation panel. On the left-hand side, shows you all of the attributes that you have in the data set. There's a couple of other data elements in there which are relevant when you're trying to figure out how much of the transformations you need to apply. The risk contribution is probably one of the biggest ones. When you run it for the first time, it shows you which one has the highest level of the biggest contributor to the risk, and you know that those need to be transformed. I'll also have a number of distinct values and the classification. So you apply the transformations, you run it a couple of times, you can revert back, you can play around with it to try to make sure that you reach the highest level of de-identification, yet maintaining the highest level of utility. That's why I say usually de-identification, it's an art and a science. On the other side, you really do have your core attributes, so to speak. So you have your level of risk. So you have the thresholds, the uniqueness, which is 0.04%, and the threshold, risk threshold. You do have your sample data, which again is our entire data set. The total population, it's an extrapolation where it's, let me give you an example because it's going to be easier, but we have the number of customers that we have, so that would be our population, but the number of potential customers that Comcast can have becomes the total population, and again, the statistical formulas extrapolate doing extrapolations as part of the risk calculation. So then you have your risk score calculations. Usually if they're not falling below the threshold, they would be red. In our case, they're green. And this process, it's done by generating the report. As we were doing this, we did kind of come up with another ideas, because we had a lot of the business teams interacting with us that needed to send a data sample to somebody, to an external vendor. And they didn't have a lot of IT support, so because we're doing all these transformations as part of the calculation anyways, I call it the once and done. So we do provide the service of actually performing the transformations on the data for these once and done type of situations, which was a huge win. I'm going to pass it back to Nupur.
You did great. We both talk too much. So this was our biggest thing, is like, will we stay on time and not like go into each other's areas. So far we're doing good. So business outcomes, actually before even talking about business outcomes, Doina talked about that risk formula and how we took that and made that ours, right? And then also the thresholds, right? These are actual numerical thresholds. And that is really, really important, that if you're interested in doing this, that you do it with an external expert who can stand behind that, who will review that calculation that you've come up with and say, yes, this will pass the muster, right, of any potential challenge in the future. And then you have to make sure that your legal team is totally on board with those thresholds, that there's documented agreement, because this really is a statistical calculation. And if somebody challenges it at a future time, which we've not had, but you have to be ready for that to be able to answer to a future challenge, right? So business outcomes, well, the biggest one is that we're able to do product innovation while maintaining regulatory compliance. So if there is goodness to be got from a data set, And this could be anything from how do we improve our service, to how do we predict, to how do we baseline, to how do we innovate. That now we can do from a de-identified data set, right? We don't have to get rid of that data. The second is ability to share data with hosted solutions. The third is the exercise the power of data without compromising the potential privacy adverse incidents, right? And that is huge for our customers and for our stakeholders. Fourth is we are minimizing the footprint of personally identifiable data. And as I always say, that data that isn't there or is de-identified is very easy to secure, right? It's, so the CISO part of me loves this for that reason, because I don't have to worry about large amounts of data and how do I protect it and all of that. Now, not to say that we don't protect de-identified data, we do. Don't let that be the headline of this, we do. But you can understand that the degree of protection is not as compelling. Offering business customers de-identification services for their data, this is what Doina just talked about, is for our own teams, we have very technically savvy teams. We can give them a specification and say, hey, if your data now conforms to this specification, it's de-identified, right? But for our third parties and other that may not be able to do that, we actually do the actual de-identification of the data set, right, for those entities. Newfound opportunities, we're always thinking about how do we improve, how do we keep getting better. We are looking at risk-based field level encryption. Again, a common response to regulatory requirements for security and privacy is encrypt everything. But that comes at a cost, right? So this lets us make a very precise decision of what we should encrypt and what we don't need to encrypt, right? So we're looking at that. Singleton deletes, so especially cascading deletes. And so remember, one of our individual rights requests is delete, right? We said, tell me what you know about me, delete what you have about me, send me what you have about me, right? So you don't have to, physically deleting something might be harder than just de-identifying a particular singleton, right? So we're looking at that. We are already integrated into our pipelines, into our CI/CD pipelines, but we want to get more and more automation in the de-identification pipeline. And then finally, we are looking at APIs so that teams can now start doing this themselves, right? We become more of a expert consulting role, and teams can just de-identify their data sets. Again, all of that is possible because we have those approved formulas when we have those approved thresholds, right? What's next? Again, continuing automation, risk-based privacy classification. So, even if you don't de-identify a data set, it is really important to understand the privacy risk in that data set, right? Because once you understand that risk, then there are all kinds of other things that can be triggered. Hey, if you're beyond this certain risk, we need extra protection, or we need to change the context, or we need to do something to just to reduce that risk, right? So we're now looking, Doina's team is now looking at how do we use these capabilities to actually identify the risk of a data set, even if that data set is never going to be de-identified, right? And then finally, how do we integrate into this process into our privacy by design? Doina talked about the intake process. This is super important because you can set up the best practice in the world, and if nobody comes to you, then what, right? And like she said, you don't want to go chasing people. So we try to integrate into our existing practices, right? The existing threat model practice, for example, one step, one outcome of that threat model practice is, what do you do with risky data, right? And we say, here, these are the kind of things you have to do, and one option you have is to go talk to Doina about de-identification, right? So we want to embed that more and more into our privacy by design practice. Because in that privacy by design practice, we have coaches. We have about 800 development teams at Comcast. And a team can be anything from a Scrum team to a release train, right? But we have processes where we touch base with every development team at least once every 90 days, right? So we have coaches and others, right? So if we now start integrating this into those processes and those systems, then we don't have to go chasing people. We just go, hey, we're talking to you. Do you know about data identification? Do we need to look at your data set? Do we need to determine its risk, and how do we get that folded in, right? So finally, this is a required slide for all RSA presentations. Joanna and I didn't get our approval for the slide deck till we had this slide in there. So apply what you've learned today. So I think this is an incremental process. It took us almost all of 2019 and some parts of 2020 to get to where we started to really make this a repeatable process. And then, of course, we've done a lot of improvements. So the first thing is to understand your scope of which laws and regulations apply to you, right? Because hopefully not all of them apply to you, right? And based on that, we need to start determining things like, okay, here are the types of your data sets. Here's your marketing data. Here's your business intelligence data. Here is your customer data. Here's your billing data. But start looking at all the data types, and then retention policies for each data type, right? This is not easy. It takes time to do that. And then understand your consumer consent platforms, right? Like what choices do your consumers have around that? Coming out of that, that'll take you a bit, so 0 to 3 months, depending on how much data you have. And then you start identifying your use cases where de-identification may be beneficial. And this will be, it'll start emerging from those conversations, right? Like, what do you use this data for? And then somebody will say, look, I need to have 3 years worth of data, I'm making the number up, to be able to do baselining, or to do true machine learning, to do true predictive analytics, right? And you go, well, nope, this type of data, you can only keep for this long. And that is where the conversation starts. Okay, what can I start transforming in this data set so that it is de-identified, and now I can start. So that discussion of where are the data that would benefit from de-identification is really important. And that can, again, take weeks and months of discussion. And then finally, we had to do it, I still remember those days, right? Like a policy, standards, guidelines, right? Like all of that grunt work that you have to do to get something that becomes part of your culture and part of your, this is how we do things. All of that is super important. Again, I wouldn't start with that, because you've got to learn a little bit before you write a policy and a standard, right? Otherwise, you're writing something in a vacuum. Evaluate opportunities for automation. The more you can automate, the easier you make it for your development teams. And then finally, drive implementation for the most critical systems. You have to do it incrementally. You can't do it all at once. Right? That's how we did it. We still have long ways to go, but we've come a long way as well. So with that, all right.
I have one more last
thought.
Doina,
we are exactly on time.
Oh, there you go. So, 2 more minutes.
Okay,
so one last thought. I just wanted to think about de-identification as a solution, not as another drag, right? So the reason why I say I don't have to go chase the teams is because it's a solution for them to be able to do what they need to do. And you usually say, hey, if you do this, you don't have to do this, and this. So it really does sell the product. So they come, we do the work. Everybody obviously wants to be compliant. Everybody wants to be able to use their data, and we give them a way to do that.
Yeah, it's really is more of a pull than a push. So, all right. With that, any questions?
Hey, this was a very awesome presentation. I really empathize with all the grunt work that we need to do for a year before we actually rally the team behind. One question I have is, everything else you described in your workflow is more engineering except for the piece of classification. That is where multiple stakeholders have to sit on a table, legal, your data, your engineering sit on a table, validate a classification, and probably to some extent, whoever is building any utilities out of that data, they all have to agree on what classifications, and then comes a technical way of injecting that classification before the data starts into your pipeline. How did you overcome that challenge?
I'll start and then I'll let Doina will have the real answer. But we really did go through each data set type that we had and went through literally each attribute of that data set. I'm telling you, it's grunt work. There's no easy way of doing it. And now the good news is that those data types, the attributes, are repeated in other data sets. So once you find it in one place and you kind of decide that, yeah, this is a primary identifier, or this is that will carry through. But we discover new types all the time. So
yeah, so as part of the data classification, the tool does have a data dictionary, which does auto-classify certain data elements, but it does have to be validated. And the reason why we have the Center of Excellence, we do have experts that know how to do the classification. This process is not exactly something that can be, it cannot be done by the application teams because of the learning curve of what needs to be done and how you look at the data. It's a completely way of how you look at the entire data set. So we do the work, and we work with them, but we do a reclass, or, we look at whatever has been classified by the tool, but then we make sure that everything stacks.
And we do pull legal in whenever needed. So we're like joined at the hip with that team. Go ahead.
I'm curious about how compliance auditing works for this process. Who comes in to run these tests? What do they pull to assure that you are still in compliance with your de-identification?
Yes, so we, of course, we statistically calculate the, so unless you statistically pass the threshold test, you're not de-identified. But how do we make sure that people are doing their retention, right, data retention? So for that, all of the other systems that we have, our 3 lines of defense, the compliance team, the audit team, all of those teams are doing that second level and third level of checking. So de-identification, it really falls under retention, but data retention policies are checked for compliance through, again, the compliance team and the audit team. Sorry, go one here and then come back to you.
Yeah, it was a great presentation. I've been here for 2 years, and I really enjoy this one. If we wanted to get additional information on this and see what is industry practices, and maybe there's an industry common threshold for the data, where would we go?
That's a really good question. I don't think
you can find me on LinkedIn, and I will send you some resources. So IAPP has good resources. There's a Privacy Institute in DC that has some good material. The spectrum of identifiability is just one perspective. It's been evolving a lot more in the last year or so because of all the new laws and regulations that are coming up, which are trying to define certain things in certain ways, and it's very interesting. I joke about it. It's very interesting when you have people that know nothing about technology write the laws, and then lawyers trying to interpret them, and you have to actually do the work.
And somebody has to implement.
Yeah, so I can send you some resources. There's also some good books on anonymization.
Yes.
And that you can.
Privacy Analytics, the company that we used, to help us in the beginning. It was really like a 3-day workshop, right?
Yeah,
and then some consulting, but they have a really good website as well.
Privacy Analytics.
Privacy Analytics.
Okay.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, my question was related to data archival. Like, are there any best practices that you typically follow and you can probably recommend? And when archive data is restored upon de-identified data, how do you ensure that that exposure does not exist?
So you're saying that I archived data set, let's say, a month ago, and after that I de-identified it.
Correct.
And then later I have to restore that
Yes.
archived data set, right? That's a good question.
We don't re-identify. So the whole premise of de-identification is there's no way for you to re-identify it. So especially when you get into strong pseudonymization and anonymization, so it's an irreversible process. If you have to, the closer you are to identifiable data, then you can use pseudonymization where you actually use encryption for certain purposes. But if you want to reach into that, that's more protection. That's more trying to protect the data, but it's not considered de-identified as such. So.
But I
Right.
think the question is, do we, and I don't know the answer to this, so you should never ask a question on stage that you don't know the answer to, but do we, when we talk to a team, do we say, hey, we've identified your current, de-identified your current data set, go and do this to your archive data set as well? That's a good question, so we should.
No, we don't.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right.
Because I mean, if you think about it, you're looking at the core data, and if it's past retention period, they have to get rid of it. So
That's true, by the way.
technically, I don't necessarily know if we have. And now I think that our biggest schedule, I think, is 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like,
So-
we don't store data for very long. So everything which is past the 7 years, somebody else makes sure that it's deleted. So
Which
or
I totally understand, but as you said, once we have archived the data and then we introduce the de-identification process, and at some point of time, say 6 months down the line, we identify that there is some data corruption, we need to research that data. Do you typically recommend making changes in the schema itself so that the restored data, which is
No.
identified data, can
No.
get de-identified?
So it's a really deep conversation. So first of all the retention policies apply to archive data as well,
Okay.
right? So you can't have data that is older than your retention policy in any
Got it.
format, right? So now the question is, do you just change the schema so that you don't have to de-identify? Usually not, because there is some data that is needed in real time or near real time to be able to do business with a customer.
Right.
That is needed for that pre-retention period. You need that data to be able to conduct your business.
Okay.
So de-identified data sets are data sets that you look at for historical reasons. You don't usually run your business on them, like real-time business. Does that make sense?
Kind of,
So
yeah,
if I'm
sure.
doing a billing transaction with a customer, right, that requires real-time data with particular schemas than if I'm looking at trends of whatever.
Makes
right?
sense. Yeah,
So-
thank
so
you.
our typical use cases, so from a policy perspective, we recommend de-identification for secondary use when data
Yes.
is used for a purpose different than the intent for what it was collected for, and two, if it's past retention period.
Okay, thank you.
Great question, though.
Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. This is a good presentation. It applies a lot to the work that I do. I did have a question. Early in the presentation, you had mentioned something. When you're not able to de-identify, you used a term I'd not heard before. You can something. It has to do with reduce the number of instances of that data. Do you recall what that was?
You mentioned that we're
Deduplication.
deduplication.
Okay, that's what I
Yes,
wanted.
yes,
Thank you. I
yes.
not, you heard that one before. But
Now, deduplication doesn't reduce your obligation
Right.
to anonymize the data, right?
Right.
But it'll reduce the number of places you have to go to anonymize the data.
Okay.
So it's more about saving time and energy. And of course, every data set that you can combine and eliminate
Right.
through deduplication, I don't have to protect that data set. I don't have to do all of the things that I have to do to secure that data set. Right.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah,
I
I think we
actually
have
had-
one more.
I had one question. It wasn't, not sure smack dab in the presentation because it was an excellent presentation. I was wondering how de-anonymization and, well, actually GDPR in particular works with SOCs. Like, what do people do there? Because SOCs maintain a lot of data that's considered identifiable, like IP addresses, and you need that for things like instant response. But like, if someone breaks in and then just says, please remove all my personal data, it would seem silly to remove it since you can't investigate. What's the thought process with involving SOCs?
There are use case exemptions for, and some of them are compliance-related exemptions. For example, I'm required to keep PCI data for a year, right? It's a requirement.
Yeah.
Security is one of those exemptions,
Exemptions.
right? Now, it's not broad. It's still narrow, and you have to go through with our legal team and make sure that we are doing the right thing there. But yes, I mean, there's some data that you have to keep to do forensics, for example, right, when you have a incident.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.